Hello, I am Kevin Grady, former director of Leeds Civic Trust for almost 30 years, from 1987 to 2016. On Wednesdays in February this year, that is 2026, I gave my 19th annual series of Leeds in Your Lunch Hour lectures. These were held at Leeds Minster. I was very delighted by the large number of people who attended the lectures. Two of the lectures in particular each drew audiences of over 250 people. And because of the strong interest, Leeds Civic Trust asked me if, following the lectures, that I'd record two of these lectures, the most important ones, so that people who were not present at the lectures could see them online. The first of the two lectures was my lecture about the granting of Leeds' first municipal charter in 1626. Well, I've already recorded that lecture, and at some point, probably very soon now, you'll be able to find a link to that lecture on the Trust website. Today, I'm recording the other lecture, which celebrated the 60th anniversary of the founding of Leeds Civic Trust. This lecture covers only part of the Trust's activities over the period from 1965 to 2025. So, given the time, it's very superficial in detail, and no doubt in future I shall give further lectures which give further details about different aspects of what the Trust did and what it was involved in. So there we are. I hope you enjoy the lecture. But before I get into the formal part of the lecture, as you might say, I thought it would be helpful to make some preliminary remarks to set context. Now, no doubt in many respects, Leeds, as represented by its city centre, has actually improved dramatically over the last 60 years. But at the same time, there's also been an equally remarkable transformation in the city's economy, as employment in its traditional industries has been replaced by employment, notably in financial and legal services, in the digital industries, in further and higher education, health, and the retail and leisure industries. Well, today's lecture focuses primarily on the city centre, but I need to make several points clear right at the start. The first is that Leeds Civic Trust's concerns and activities extend way beyond the city centre, pretty well embracing what we used to describe as the old county borough area. The second thing to say is that the rising prosperity of the city has not been shared equally across its inhabitants, and the evident wealth demonstrated by the city centre is not reflected in the significant deprivation in the inner city areas, including Hunslet, Holbeck, Beeston, and areas particularly on the south side of the city, but also on areas on the north inner city area, northeast side of the city. My lecture tends to focus on the successes which the Trust has experienced, but it also notes topics which have been failures or only partial successes. It's also important to emphasise that Leeds Civic Trust, as essentially a voluntary organisation, has no statutory powers. Its chief power is the power of persuasion. In the next 45 minutes or so, I will look at city developments, issues and projects in which the Trust has been involved or taken a close interest, or played a part in over the past 60 years. I suspect that this lecture, a very much expanded version of it, will be turned into a book perhaps in the next 3 or 4 years. My lecture is structured by theme rather than by chronology. And I should give you a health warning. That is that I have less than 1 minute per year. So it's going to be a rapid whistle-stop tour of the last 60 years. In this lecture, I'm using twice as many slides as I would normally do in a lecture of this length. So it's going to be a bit like watching a time-lapse camera. Many of you will see your life whizzing before you as I go through the various changes in the city. So my advice is to fasten your seatbelts and hopefully you'll enjoy the ride. Leeds Civic Trust held its inaugural meeting on the 25th of October 1965, and it was endowed with the magnificent gift of £50,000 by the Leeds-born printing press manufacturing magnate, Mr. Charles H. Crabtree, who we see in this press cutting. The constitution of the trust as a charity stated that its aims and objectives were, firstly, to stimulate public interest and care for the beauty, history, and character of the city and locality. Its second main objective was to encourage high standards of design, architecture, and town planning. And its third objective was to encourage the development and improvement of features of general amenity. And finally, its fourth objective was to promote and organize cooperation in the achievements of these objectives. So it started with quite broad, but nevertheless quite clearly defined objectives. Now, none of us will remember Park Row as Atkinson Grimshaw recorded it in this famous painting of 1882, showing Park Row. The fact was that Park Row looked very similar to this, even in the early 1960s, except for the fact that the church at the top of the picture at the end of the row, St. Anne's, had been demolished. And on the left, we see the portico of the City Museum, which had also been demolished. The reason I'm showing you this picture is that it has special significance for the creation of Leeds Civic Trust. John Hepper, the trust's first chairman and effectively his founder, used to say that it was the wanton destruction in 1965 of the building on the right of this picture that prompted him to take action. The building on the right is Beckett's Bank, the magnificent Venetian Gothic palazzo building designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, no less, which had opened in 1867. John said that it was the demolition of this building which made him resolve that something needed to be done to prevent such disasters in future. The Westminster Bank, as the bank was then known, had spent a considerable amount of money on this building in the late 1950s, and it looked absolutely superb. But suddenly, it was no longer there. In the mid-1960s, like many other cities, Leeds was in the grip of development mania. It was the new affluence of the swinging 60s. Developers and city fathers were bent on sweeping away what they regarded as nasty, grimy, old-fashioned Victorian buildings, and they wanted to rebuild their cities in the modern style, in an era in which the car was becoming king. As Alan Bennett wrote, until 1960, central Leeds was rather like a Victorian Florence in its architectural style. Now, in this view of Edwardian view of City Square, we see on the right the Royal Exchange with its wonderful tower and clock. This building was demolished in 1964, so it had already gone the way of Beckett's Bank. In this postcard view, of 1903, we see City Square again, looking pretty magnificent. Mill Hill Chapel on the right, and to the left of the picture, we see the Standard Life Insurance Company premises. Well, what replaced these impressive buildings of the period? Well, in this view of 1970, we see that Beckett's Bank had been replaced on the right by the awful new concrete National Westminster Bank, which had opened in 1967. Meanwhile, in 1969, that attractive Edwardian Standard Life building had been replaced by the soon-to-be despised bluish-looking Norwich Union building. Itself, it was demolished in 1995 because people really disliked it. The extent of the comprehensive redevelopment further of the late 1960s and early 70s is demonstrated by this 1974 aerial view looking down to the site which had been cleared for the creation of the Bond Street Shopping Centre, later known as the Leeds Shopping Plaza, and today part of Trinity West. We see this site surrounded by modern high-rise office blocks. In the top right-hand corner, we see the new Royal Exchange House, which had opened in 1966. And at the bottom right of the picture, we see West Riding House, opened on Albion Street in 1975. I noted that in the Trust's report for 1975, it was said that this building, West Riding House, now I think called Pinnacle, had done more damage to the character of Leeds City Centre than any other new building. So it was in this context that the founders of Leeds Civic Trust felt they needed to attempt to fight both for good town planning and to prevent the wanton destruction of the city's heritage while encouraging the improvement of Leeds. It's worth noting, by the way, that within 12 months of its foundation, the Trust bought the derelict Bear Pit on Cardigan Road in Headingley with a view to demonstrating the Trust's commitment to conserving important historic buildings. And in fact, in the next 4 or 5 years, the Trust did renovate this building to good effect. The Trust saw one of its first tasks was to establish and convince people that Leeds had an architecture worth respecting. With this in view, it persuaded John Betjeman to come up to Leeds to make the BBC television film called A Poet Goes North. The Trust contributed 200 guineas towards its cost. Now, here we see in this picture John Betjeman, the poet laureate, on the left, our president, Lord Wade, in the middle, and our chairman, John Hepper, on the right, at our Temple Newsome soiree held in honour of John Betjeman's visit in 1968. I have to say that we were quite a posh lot in those days. I don't think we'd have soirees today. And here we see another of the Trust events. This is the soiree at Kirkstall Abbey House in 1968. I mean, soirees were the thing. And when I became director of the Trust in 1987, when I pulled open my desk drawer, I heard this clinking and I thought, what on earth is this? And it turned out to be the sherry glasses that the council of the Trust used because they used to drink sherry at council meetings. Anyway, here we see our members at another event in 1968, the Oldie English evening at Kirkstall Abbey House. Note the Oldie English piano accordion being played at the time. Many of you will remember, well, those of you that, like me, are 75 or perhaps above 60, certainly, many of you will remember that when you posted a letter in Leeds in the early 1970s, it was franked with the slogan, Leeds Motorway City of the 70s. The rise of the motor car, motorways, and major road building was to have a dramatic impact on Leeds. The challenge for Leeds City Council and the Civic Trust was how to respond to both the opportunity offered, but also the threat. I found this is actually two pictures that I found in the Civic Trust archive, which were separate pictures which I joined together. And I couldn't think, well, where is this awful wasteland? Well, of course, this is the areas of land cleared sort of between Hunslet and Holbeck for the coming M621 motorway. In this next view, the threat to the character of the city centre was enormous, as Colin Buchanan's famous national report, Traffic in Towns, recommended Leeds. There was a case study of Leeds, and Buchanan recommended the wholesale demolition of property in the city centre to make way for cars. This is a story for another day, but here you see the amount of demolition involved going on in the early 70s for the creation of the Westgate Inner Ring Road roundabout. So essentially, it was this climate in which the trust was created. What I'm going to do now is to turn by themes to the areas of trust activities over the last 60 years, which were particularly prominent. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a little bit about the leading personnel of the trust from its early years actually to the present day. Now, in this picture of the chairman of the trust, we see John Hepper, who was chairman for 17 years. He was succeeded by Olav Arnold, then Robert Collins, then John Richards, and then Peter Baker, who chaired until 2010. I put a picture of Mike Pitt in this illustration because he has been chairman of the Trust's planning committee from 2004 and is still chairman, so he's done over 20 years and he's been a fantastic chair of that committee. And for your entertainment, I've also included this photograph of myself when I was first appointed in 1987, looking very smart, very much younger, with rather more hair. Well, from 2010, the ladies took over, in that the next three chairs of the trust were and have been women. Linda Kitching, who we see on the right, to 2016, Jane Taylor until 2024. And then moving on to this view, I retired in 2016, as you see here, and with me is Jenna Strover, a building surveyor who was in her early 20s when I first met her. And the moment I came to meet her, I thought, she's got enormous potential for the trust and we must snap up her voluntary services. And of course, here we see the situation today. I was succeeded by Martin Hamilton in late 2016, succeeded as director. And happily, Jenna has fulfilled the potential I saw, and in 2024 she became the youngest ever chair of Leeds Civic Trust. So, having looked at the early years, I'll now move on to the themes. Clearly, right from the start, heritage and the protection and conservation of heritage buildings in the city was a priority, not the main priority, but a priority of the trust. In 1970, at public inquiry, we managed to save the Moorish warehouse in Park Square from demolition. And in 1971, again at public inquiry, we managed to save the Bank of England building on Park Row from demolition. Really important buildings. However, in 1974, we lost at public inquiry, trying to stop the comprehensive redevelopment of Boar Lane. But happily, recession and some fortuitous bankruptcies meant that the buildings weren't demolished, but they were just left to decay. And there we see them in such an appalling condition in the early 1990s. In 1987, I organised, as the new director of the trust, organised a meeting with the owners of the properties on Boar Lane, including MEPC, and that meeting helped secure the retention and renovation of the buildings. Now we see them today as they are, finally restored. We have to admit that it was a facade job. Essentially, the outer casings of the building survived, but they were gutted inside and fitted up in a modern fashion. But the fact was that the saving of the facades has been so important to retaining the character of the street. Well, other successes followed. The third White Cloth Hall was threatened by demolition, but happily we persuaded the owners to renovate it in the 1990s, a great success there. Likewise, Bank Mills, which is opposite the Royal Armouries on the river, just beyond Crown Point Bridge, Bank Mills was saved from demolition by when we got it listed, and it was beautifully renovated as offices. We ourselves engaged in our own piece of building conservation in 1991-92 when we bought and renovated 17 to 19 Wharf Street as our headquarters. Over the years, for many years in fact, we battled hard to try and save the historic First White Cloth Hall in Kirkgate from collapse and demolition. Here you see it in a terrible condition and what it had looked like when it was originally built. Well, happily, our efforts were rewarded when at the 11th hour in 2016, when we were able to persuade Rushbond plc to buy the building. Jonathan Maud has always been a great supporter of conserving the city's heritage, and his company Rushbond produced this wonderful part renovation and part rebuilding of the Cloth Hall. For almost 40 years, we also battled alongside the parishioners to try to save Mount St Mary's Church at Richmond Hill from being demolished. In that, we failed, but in the end, in the campaign that is, but in the end, virtue has been rewarded. I took this slide just a couple of weeks ago, and you'll see that what has now happened to the building is that the Pugin, chancel and transept of Mount St Mary's Church at Richmond Hill has actually been conserved, and the nave, which has been demolished, has been replaced by, or is being replaced, as you can see, the building work is going on, is being replaced by a new structure in the same shape and form as the nave, but the whole building will be flats, residential flats of a good high standard. So that is particularly pleasing. And it just shows that if you wait long enough and you keep pressing, you do get results. Finally, last summer, Richard Voss, Graham Castle, and Martin Hamilton achieved the wonderful renovation of the Bear Pit in Cardigan Road. I'm particularly grateful to them. This is a scheme that went on for years trying to renovate the building, and finally a lot of money, a lot of the trust's money has been spent splendidly renovating the building, and you should go and look at it. So moving on then, that was heritage. What about high quality architecture? As is well known, in response to the public's dislike of modern architecture of the 1960s and 70s, the City Council rejected the design for the replacement building for the much liked Schofield's department store, built in 1967. It was a great Leeds institution. When the scheme for the building to replace this building was went before the planning committee, Councillor Brian Walker said they rejected it because it needed to have more of what he described as a Leeds feel about it. Well, this was the resulting replacement for that building. This is the new Schofield Centre, now known as the Core, which opened in 1990. The planners decided that the Leeds feel, dubbed by Ken Powell as the Leeds look, consisted of the use of traditional materials, that is red brick, stone dressings and grey slate roofs. This style was applied in this new Schofield Centre, which produced this absolutely bland, characterless building. But as time went on, this Leeds look style seemed to become almost obligatory. And if architects and developers wanted to get planning permission for their building, they felt, design buildings that looked somewhat like this. In his famous Architects Journal article, denigrating builder design in Leeds, the article Ken Powell entitled The Offence of the Inoffensive, Ken described the new Asda building on the waterfront, the national headquarters of this supermarket group, as a bloated bungalow. And you can see what he means. Well, the Trust sensed the great frustration at discontent amongst Leeds architects and decided to organise a debate to discuss this with the City Council. It was an infamous debate held perhaps appropriately on Valentine's Day 1990, and such was the strong opposition and anger of the architects and developers revealed in this debate that it did produce a change in the attitude of the City Council to new design. And Councillor Brian Walker said, in future, if you believe you can design good, attractive, modern buildings, we will welcome them and give them proper consideration. Well, the impressive number 1 City Square, which we see here, opened in 1994, and unofficially it was the first of the new generation of non-Leeds look buildings. Not that long after that, this building, the Scottish Mutual building in Park Row, opened, designed by Carey Jones. The thought of inserting a glass-fronted building in Park Row would have been anathema just 10 years beforehand. And the same practice, Carey Jones also erected Prince's Exchange, which opened in 1990, close to the railway station. A bold statement of modern design, if you ever saw one. The elegant and stylish and beautifully landscaped Wellington Place office park, between Whitehall Road and Wellington Street, is a fine example of how you can, in a modern idiom, design an elegant and beautiful office park, and it set new standards for office park design in the city. Well, one of the biggest issues in recent years has been the question of tall buildings. It would be fair to say that certainly in the first 40 years of its existence, the Trust generally disapproved of tall buildings in the city centre, and this was for a variety of reasons. It disliked the aesthetic of the 1960s and 1970s tower blocks. It felt they were out of scale, brash, bad neighbours amidst the characterful Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian heritage buildings of the city centre. It also thought that if these buildings were inappropriately sited, that they would do great damage to the best views of the skyline of Leeds. Here we see the view of the city skyline in 2004, just over 20 years ago, and we see the lift shaft on the right of this picture of Bridgewater Place. The Trust strongly opposed the 32-storey Bridgewater Place on aesthetic grounds and on fears that it would create wind tunnelling. Well, despite our objections, it was completed in 2007, and as many of you will know, did in fact cause major wind tunnelling problems. But at the time, it was the tallest building in the city centre. From 2004, there was a big spate of applications for very tall buildings, and the Trust Planning Committee, I have to admit, was rather seduced by the design of this 55-storey pair of buildings known as the Kissing Towers, which would have been on Sovereign Street. However, this big impetus to these very tall buildings gave way when the world financial crisis of 2007-8 killed off almost all of these big schemes. Really, the only one to survive that process, a tallish building in that it was 23 stories high, the Rusty Tower, as some people call it, Broadcasting Place on the Woodhouse Lane, was completed in 2009 and was actually voted the world's best skyscraper for that year. The Trust rather liked this building, though some of you, I imagine, would disagree. Well, the genie is now out of the bottle, and for good or ill, very tall buildings are popping up all over the city centre. You'd have to say that, in effect, the planners have given up trying to control the spread of these buildings for good or ill. Most of the blocks that are being put up at the moment are residential, quite a lot of them for students, and currently, as Martin Hamilton was telling me recently, the Trust supports the notion of purpose-built student accommodation in the city centre. But there's a constant worry about the possible consequences if the bubble in demand for this type of development bursts. What will we be left with? Well, I now move on to the public realm and placemaking. Right from the start, the Trust had an Open Spaces Committee, and it immediately embraced the council's project to pedestrianise Commercial Street and Lands Lane, which was completed in 1970. At 700 yards, here you see the before and after, at 700 yards in length, it was believed to be the first and certainly the longest pedestrianised shopping street in Europe. It's really quite a claim. At once, the Trust was fully supportive of this and decided that it would pay for some mature trees, relatively mature trees, to be planted in Commercial Street. And here we see John Hepper with other Trust members at the launching of those trees. The Trust at that time had a Trees for Leeds campaign. The Trust also, to enhance the development, paid and ran a competition for the design of a fountain to go in Lands Lane. And in fact, some of you will remember the fountain, which was installed and actually was quite a feature in the street, but was swept away because effectively it was an obstacle to pedestrian movement. Also, as with many fountains in Leeds, it never really worked properly. Throughout its existence, the Trust has encouraged the improvement and provision of public spaces and pocket parks in the city. In 1997, we organised another big debate, this time about the future of City Square, which was looking very sorry for itself and effectively had become just a large traffic island. What ensued was John Thorpe, the civic architect's excellent remodelling and renewal of the square, which was completed in 2003 and which we see here. The relatively recent closure of City Square to traffic, other than buses, that is, and cyclists, the closure of the square was a long-held aspiration by the Trust, but unfortunately it has not yet produced a suitable design for the square. Fortunately, in my view, the lack of money has prevented the totally inappropriate Glade proposal from going ahead. We see the proposal here, and the worst aspects of it is that part of the proposal is to remove most of the statuary from City Square. Around 1995, the Trust was, with others, notably Trust corporate members Peter Connolly and Ian Todd, the Trust with others proposed the creation of a new public square in front of the Civic Hall. Here we see it as it was before development. The idea was to close Cookridge Street and would enhance the area of space. Happily, the City Council endorsed the idea and ran with it, and it was adopted as part of the city's Millennium Fund bid. I sat on the commissioning panel for the square on the Trust's behalf, and in 2001, Millennium Square opened. It's proved to be a very considerable asset to the city, even if its aesthetic appeal was compromised somewhat by the functional requirements of it being designed as a concert venue. Well, just briefly, I want to jump onto the subject of public art. The Trust long argued that the city needed much more public art. Initially, progress on introducing more public art was very slow, but things improved greatly from the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The Trust made its own contribution to increasing the provision of public art when, with the Wainwright Trust's financial support, we commissioned the Arthur Aaron statue or piece of art at the end of the hedgerow or Eastgate, and this was unveiled as the Millennium statue in 2001. Trust corporate member Rushbond also have put pieces of public art into virtually all of their developments in the city centre. On the right here we see Steeped Vessels, which is at Brewery Wharf, which opened in 2006. And much more recently, former Trust Council member Pippa Hale unveiled her wonderful artwork Ribbons, which is at Quarry Hill, celebrating a lot of the women who made a major contribution to the life of the city over the years. This opened in 2024. Now, for a complete change of subject, the issue of improving the city's public transport system. From the start, the Trust had a transport committee, and over the years it has made strenuous efforts to argue the case for public transport improvements and has commented in great detail on major road and rail projects. We lobbied for a new bus station, and that when a new bus station was created, that the coach station, which you may remember was on Wellington Street, should actually be combined with the new bus station. Happily, this was achieved when the new combined bus and coach station, which of course is open today, opened opposite Quarry Hill in 1996. The Trust has also lobbied for and supported proposals for a rapid transit system for the city. As is only too well known, we are the largest city in Europe not to have a rapid transit system. From the 1990s, as you see here, we supported the 3-line Supertram scheme And we were absolutely devastated when it was finally cancelled by Alistair Darling in 2005. We then supported the NGT trolleybus scheme with some reluctance, though we thought a system of some sort was better than nothing. But then from 2009 until the scheme was cancelled in 2016, we maintained our support, although frankly, it wasn't going to be a particularly good scheme. However, the main point is that it is hugely frustrating that so much money has been wasted on not achieving a scheme, and it is absolutely appalling the way central government has ill-treated the city and messed us about in a whole range of ways by promising to support schemes and then finally, in the end, cancelling them by either not giving them approval or by just simply not providing the money. Whether Tracy Brabin's West Yorkshire Rapid Transit scheme, currently mooted, will ever see the light of day, who knows? I'm not holding my breath. Well, have we fared better when it comes to the railways? Well, the station has been upgraded in various ways. Here we see the new, well, I say new, but within the last 15 years, the southern entrance to the railway station. So that is definitely an improvement. And currently, you'll be aware that major work has been going on in Bishopgate Street. This photograph is only about 3 weeks old, to try and improve the access from Bishopgate Street into the station. I think it'll look impressive when it's done, and certainly it will be an improvement. Mike Peart, chairman of our planning committee, who I mentioned earlier, produced this proposal for the reconfiguration of the HS2 Network Rail's initial designs for how the HS2 station could be combined with our existing city centre station. It's a little T-shaped design. To our great delight, HS2 did actually accept Mike's proposal, and it would have been a major improvement to how the two stations were going to be configured. But of course, sadly, as it turns out, HS2 has been cancelled. Fundamentally, the city has been badly let down by central government over HS2, and doing a rough calculation, had I worked out that had the money wasted on not delivering HS2 and not delivering the earlier tram schemes, had this money been handed over to Leeds City Council, we would have had a pretty good rapid transit system by now. Well, I'm now going to move on to the renaissance of the city centre waterfront. By the 1960s and the early 70s, the River Aire carried little freight, and the city centre stretch of the river was highly polluted, and many of its buildings were semi-derelict. The Trust, however, saw the potential and spearheaded a campaign to regenerate the waterfront and to turn it into a major leisure amenity. In 1973, we produced what you see on the screen, this groundbreaking report, Let's Put Leeds Upon Air. It showed how the waterfront could be regenerated. You have to think quite hard now to remember just how bad the waterfront was in those days. Here we see the semi-derelict stretch of the river. In this photo I took in 1985, the stretch of the river running from Victoria Bridge to Leeds Bridge. From 1973, the Trust relentlessly campaigned for footpaths, footbridges to be put on the riverside, and for the conservation of the heritage buildings along the waterfront. It also encouraged good quality modern development of homes, cafes and offices. And you may see that the stretch of river on the right-hand side is where that bloated bungalow, the Asda building, was finally erected. Waterfront development progressed steadily from 1987, the year in which our sister organisation was set up, and which I ran from the trust office as the part-time director. So I was part-time director of the trust and part-time director of Eye on the Air for about 7 years. Here we see Victoria Quays, the first residential development on the waterfront in the former Aaron Calder Navigation warehouses. Here we see the Design Innovation Centre, a great conversion of a grain warehouse to offices, and this scheme was completed in the late 1980s. So change was starting to come really quite quickly. One of the eyesores, the great eyesores of the Riverside area, was the 1840s new dock, or sometimes known as Tatey Basin, which we see here in 1988. Here we see the dock regenerated. This was completed in 2005, and the stimulus for the regeneration of the dock, which is really very good, the stimulus came from Leeds Development Corporation. The great catalyst to the regeneration of the dock was the success of the Development Corporation and Leeds City Council in luring the Royal Armouries Museum to Leeds. The museum was opened by the Queen in 1996. Well, there were further developments on the western waterfront as well. There were new flats, a hotel was built, and here we see at what is now known as Granary Wharf, the City Inn, well, of course, in those days known as the City Inn, the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, with the two the two residential developments which go with it. And despite the fact that we had some reluctance about the height of these buildings, in fact, the development has been exceptionally successful and attracts lots of visitors, and it has lots of cafes and restaurants. So, in fact, it has worked very well. And happily, over the past 20 years, the regeneration of the Riverside has spread further east in the Hunslet direction. And here we see some very stylish sustainable houses built by a company called Situ in what is now known as the Climate Innovation District of Leeds on the Hunslet waterfront. Still further down, we find and see in this view Hunslet Mill. Well, at the time I took this photograph, almost 40 years ago, essentially this was in my pre-Leeds Civic Trust days when I was volunteering to help and work with the Victorian Society. I was successful in getting this grade 2-star building listed. Well, nobody really saw any hope for it, and indeed at the time I got it listed, it had holes drilled in it for the sticks of dynamite to go in to blow it up. Well, gratifyingly, if you wait long enough, and with that listed building protection and the persistence of the trust in pursuing the case for the retention of this building, here is that building as I photographed it about 3 weeks ago. It's now being converted into luxury flats and shows again, if you are persistent and insistent, good things can be done. Well, now I'm just going to move on to the issue of placemaking. Continuing the theme then, some of you will remember, if you came to my lectures 2 or 3 years ago at Leeds Minster, that in the year 2000, the Trust produced its report, Bridge End, Dead End. And in that report, we advocated the remodelling of the Bridge End area to make it an attractive and welcoming location. And you can see on the right-hand side of this image, just south of Leeds Bridge, you can see how we thought that the road space should be reallocated and the opportunity for putting some new buildings there. Happily, some 20 years later, several of the proposals in that report have actually been acted on. And here we see the new layout of Bridge End, created ineffectively as the entrance to what is now known as Ayr Park. Here we see part of that area, again taken just a couple of weeks ago, the stunning central artwork at Bridge End, Hibiscus, which was unveiled in November 2023. In the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, 15 years of frenetic building activity in the city centre came to a very dramatic stop. Seizing the opportunity of a major pause in development activity, a group of the Trust's planning committee members and some of its corporate members formed Leeds Sustainable Development Group to campaign for this sustainable regeneration of what we called then City Centre South. The group produced this plan of the area showing all the development sites that were available. The idea was to try and create a coherent redevelopment of this area, as opposed to simply having miscellaneous planning applications and buildings popping up in miscellaneous locations with no thought to how it would all work together. The City Council essentially adopted the idea of City Centre South, but rebranded it as Leeds South Bank. The Trust and Leeds Sustainable Development Group nominated City Centre South to be one of the government's proposed garden cities. While that proposal wasn't accepted, just over a year ago, we were very pleased when this area was selected for investment as one of the government's 8 new towns. So again, the idea has been successful in the end and has been taken up. One of the Sustainable Development Group's proposals was for the creation of a park on the former Tetley's brewery site. This too was adopted and backed by the City Council, and indeed promoted by Leeds City Council. And today the park, as we see here, is well on the way to being created as part of the Vastint housing and office development on the Tetley site. And it's already attracting a lot of visitors in the nice weather. In the last 3 or 4 years, the Trust, with partners, has developed a long-term project to rejuvenate the area between Quarry Hill, Saxon Gardens and Leeds Minster. Here we see some of the proposals. The good news is the Trust's collaborators in the project, a company called Urban Wilderness, were nominated for the National Landscape Award last year. And we're seeing the beginning of change in the area with the proposed rejuvenation of Penny Pocket Park, that green space between the Minster and the railway viaduct. Well, what about heritage, information and education? The first declared objective of Leeds Civic Trust was to stimulate public interest in the history, character of the city and its locality. Probably the most effective way it's done this is through our historic blue plaque scheme. One of my first tasks as director was to get the scheme off the ground, and here you see me on the left at the unveiling of the first blue plaque in November 1987. This was for the Burley Barstone, which was housed in the foyer of the Leeds and Holbeck Building Society headquarters on the hedgerow, where the Barstone had originally stood before the building was erected. The Barstone marked one of the boundaries of the medieval town of Leeds. Needless to say, the scheme for the blue plaques has gone from strength to strength. We had reached plaque number 161 by the time I retired 29 years later. For me, one of the most memorable unveilings was when in 2006, Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend of The Who unveiled the plaque at Leeds University Refectory to celebrate it as a legendary rock venue. On Martin Hamilton's watch, as Trust Director, the pace of unveilings has not slackened. In November 2024, as we see here, plaque number 200 was unveiled at the Northern School of Contemporary Dance on Chapeltown Road to celebrate its founder, Nardine Senior. The Trust has educated and informed the public and visitors to the city in many other ways. In 1994, we began our Supper Walk programme, and that still goes on. In 1999, we began to coordinate the city's annual Heritage Open Days, still the largest programme in any city outside London. We've produced many guidebooks to the city and a range of publications over the years. And of course, in 2007, we began my annual Leeds in Your Lunch Hour lecture series, which, as you know, continues to this day. Well, another change of subject. What about city centre shopping and out-of-town shopping centres? The Trust has always felt that it's vital to protect the vibrancy of Leeds as a shopping centre. When a large part of Leeds Kirkgate Market was destroyed by fire at Christmas 1975, we knew trouble was going to lie ahead for the future of Leeds Market. In 1988, we risked being made bankrupt due to the threats of libel actions when we supported the market traders in opposing a public inquiry, the MAB redevelopment scheme for the market. You see an illustration of this here, and effectively what MAB were going to do was to retain part of the market building, but effectively put the market itself in a basement in what in effect was a very long shopping centre, a very big one with the bus station at one end. Well, happily, the inspector took note of our views and the MAB scheme was thrown out. And following that, in 1995, thanks to the actions of the Norwich Union, who owned the building, the Kirkgate Market building was fantastically renovated. Also in 1988, on the Trust's behalf, I spoke at the out-of-town shopping centre public inquiry. We were supporting the council's opposition to the proposals to build the White Rose Centre, the Owlcote Centre, and another large out-of-town shopping centre at Lawnswood. From our perspective, these out-of-town shopping centres were going to do great damage to the success of Leeds City Centre as a shopping destination. The result was that, sorry, I just jumped back there. Here you see Briggate with cars going up and down. This would be taken in the early 1970s, maybe 1968, 69, something like that. Basically, what Leeds City Council did, they recognised that if they were going to see off these out-of-town shopping centre inquiries at the public inquiry, in the end, permission was given for the whole of the scheme for the White Rose Centre. The Alcoats project was given permission, but for half the size in terms of its retail capacity, and the Lawnswood out-of-town shopping centre proposal was just thrown out wholeheartedly. But we knew something was coming, and the City Council, with John Trickett's initiative, decided that effectively to repel that competition or to compete with it, that Briggate needed to be pedestrianised. And so this is what happened. And this proved to me, this pragmatism proved to be a really great success. Here we see Briggate pedestrianised, thronged as it always is at the weekend and often during the weekdays with thousands of shoppers. But pedestrianisation gave people confidence in the future of Briggate as a shopping area. So the shopping arcades were very successfully invested in and renovated. Likewise, the Corn Exchange was wonderfully converted into a shopping centre in 1990, and the Victoria Quarter was created with Harvey Nichols as its main focal point. Since then, the city has retained its retail vitality, and the masterstroke, in my view, was the opening in 2013 of the Trinity Centre, the Trinity Shopping Centre, also sort of leisure facilities there, cafes, a cinema, etc. But this has tied together the heart of the shopping streets of Leeds. 3 years after this, in 2016, John Lewis and Victoria Gate opened. Well, these combined with the Victoria Quarter have enabled Leeds to remain the regional centre for high-end shopping in Yorkshire. Well, what of major cultural and business facilities? I'm almost at the end of the lecture. There's a lot to cover, but dealing with this in brief. Charles Crabtree financed the establishment of the Civic Trust, in part because he wanted his home city to have major amenities, certainly an exhibition centre, and almost certainly with that conference facilities. From my start as director of the trust, I noted what Charles Crabtree's ambitions had been, and I ensured that the trust consistently campaigned for the city to have 4 major amenities. That is, a modern concert hall, a conference centre, an exhibition centre, and an arena to go with it. The council was opposed to all 4 of these proposals or suggestions, primarily for financial reasons. And of course, in the case of a conference venue, they were concerned about the possible impact of that on the prosperity of Harrogate with its own conference centre. But having said this, with the trust backing, and rather more importantly, with the financial backing of the National Lottery Fund, the council did and has put money into the renovation of major facilities in Leeds. Here we see the City Varieties, which was wonderfully renovated a few years ago. Likewise, the Grand Theatre has had millions of pounds spent on it, especially with Richard Mantle of Opera North as the key driving force. Opera North has also subsequently wonderfully transformed the former assembly room next to the Grand Theatre, and it thrives today as the Howard Assembly Rooms. New facilities were also created at Quarry Hill. The College of Music moved there, and the venue was created over the BBC building. Likewise, the Northern Ballet Theatre and Phoenix Dance also gained a splendid new building at Quarry Hill. And more recently, the West Yorkshire Playhouse, which had been built more or less as the first building on Quarry Hill in the late 1980s. The West Yorkshire Playhouse, now known as the Leeds Playhouse, has been remodelled and enhanced. But what of a modern concert hall? In the years when the Trust was campaigning strongly for a new concert hall, most of the big cities were getting new concert halls financed partly by the Heritage Lottery Fund or the Lottery Fund and partly by grants from Europe. However, Leeds City Council was totally resistant to the notion of there being a new concert hall in Leeds. I mean, it's clear its chief fear was that the town hall would be made redundant if a concert hall was built. So money was invested in trying to raise the quality and the acoustics and the convenience of the town hall. It had a major refurbishment and enhancement which was completed in the year 2000, an excellent scheme by John Thorpe, which we see here. It is a magnificent building. But of course, it wasn't enough, and these buildings have to be maintained. So the town hall closed again in 2021 for a major refurbishment. Here we see a relatively recent picture of the work going on in there. The current scheme is creating new bars. It had been hoped that it would also include a second performance space in one of the former courtrooms, and provision is being made and will be made for making the building much more acceptable. At the same time, the town hall organ has been totally rebuilt. The building should reopen at long last at the tail end of this year, that is 2026, but unfortunately without the second performance space. The problem is these things are very costly, but it will be a tremendous improvement in the building. However, the most gratifying achievement from the Trust's perspective is that following a really tenacious campaign by the Trust in September 2013, finally, the first direct arena opened. Well, it's not the exhibition centre that Charles Crabtree wanted, but it is significant progress in that direction, and there is currently talk, quite serious talk, of creating exhibition facilities at the Royal Armouries. We'll have to wait and see on that. But I must come to my conclusions now. Looking at the Trust's role in all the topics I've covered in the lecture, at times we have to be careful not to overstate the part the Trust had played. After all, most of the key decisions are made by Leeds City Council officers, and the money that pays for the improvements of Leeds often is provided by city business. Nevertheless, I think that even where the Trust has not been closely involved in many of these schemes, it has been important in influencing the climate of opinion. Sometimes in giving our support for these projects, we've helped to give others the confidence to undertake them. Sometimes the thought of the Trust's potential vocal opposition has encouraged people to think twice when contemplating injudicious decisions. But I think, above all, the thing that pleases me most, and really quite an achievement for a small, effectively voluntary organisation, is that over the years, the Trust's views have come to be regarded with great respect. My overall view about Leeds is that the city has immense potential and it has a very promising but intriguing future. We'll have to see. Today, Leeds Civic Trust is an exceptionally well-resourced civic society, though we call it a trust and it's actually a company. It's better resourced than it has ever been. It has a great staff and more of them than it has ever had. and it has a committed and talented group of trustees and volunteers. It's also extremely well supported by its individual members and its corporate members, of which there are at least 80. So the trust is in a very good position. So the question is, what next for the trust? Well, the answer is that the trust is moving. Within the next 4 months, the trust is moving from 17 to 19 Wharf Street to new offices at 17 to 19 Park Place. Park Place is between Park Square and Wellington Street. And there's no mistake in the numbers. It's a very curious coincidence that our current building and our future building both are numbered 17 to 19. From our new premises, which will open at York Place in 4 months' time, I feel that the trust is in the very capable hands of Jenna Strover, who we see on the right, chair of the trust, and Martin Hamilton as director. And I feel very confident that the trust, like the city, will continue to flourish. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.